Sometimes the most unimaginable horror stories are hiding right in plain sight. In the quiet, perfectly manicured suburbs of Indianapolis, one man curated a flawless family image, but his backyard, it held a secret that was beyond ghastly. It was a graveyard.
It really is the question at the heart of this entire thing, isn't it? How can a guy who seems to have it all, a successful businessman, a husband, a father of three, turn out to be one of the most prolific serial killers in Indiana's history, all while his family is sleeping right under the same roof?
And this is where it all starts to unravel. Not with some big police raid, but with a kid just playing in his own backyard. He finds a human skeleton, and his dad, Herb Baumeister, casually tells him, "Oh, that's just a medical specimen." Yeah, that specimen was the very first clue to a killing field he'd been cultivating on his own property.
To really get what happened at his home, Fox Hollow Farm, we first have to understand the two completely separate, completely different lives that Herb Baumeister was leading.
I mean, just look at this contrast. It's jarring. On one side, you've got the total American dream, right? A super successful entrepreneur who founded the Save-A-Lot thrift store chain, a family man living on this beautiful 18-acre estate. But the private reality, it's a whole other story, a deeply disturbing one, with a history of severe mental illness, really bizarre childhood behavior, and a marriage that was, according to his wife, basically a sham.
When he was just a teenager, his own father had him mentally examined, and he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. So the warning signs were there from a really young age. But here's the thing. After that initial diagnosis, he got no further psychiatric treatment. Nothing. So these incredibly dangerous tendencies were just left to fester, in private, for decades.
So while Herb is living this bizarre double life, a whole other story is playing out in the gay bars of Indianapolis. And it's this story that's going to eventually lead investigators right to his front door.
The police knew something was seriously wrong. Men, one after another, who were all about the same age, height, and weight, were just vanishing. Poof, gone. They were all last seen in the city's gay bars, but the trail would just go completely cold every single time. The police were hunting for a predator, but they had no idea he was hiding behind the mask of a respected family man.
This right here, this was the break they needed. A survivor, a man named Tony Harris, came forward with an absolutely terrifying story. He'd met this guy, Brian Smart, who took him back to this huge fancy mansion, but the night turned violent, and Harris barely, and I mean barely, escaped with his life. He also told police he thought this Brian Smart was the one responsible for his friend Roger Goodlet's disappearance.
So here's how it all came together. Tony Harris, totally determined to get justice for his missing friend, actually spots Brian Smart again a year later. He follows him, gets the license plate number, and takes it straight to the police. The plate comes back to Herbert Baumeister. Investigators go to his house, but both Herb and his wife Julie refuse a search. It took 2 more years, with Julie becoming more and more terrified of her husband's behavior, before she finally filed for divorce and gave police the consent they needed to search the property. Okay, so Herb's on vacation, and investigators finally get to search the wooded parts of this huge 18-acre property. What they found? Well, it was worse than anything they could have possibly braced themselves for. They started finding human bones almost immediately. And then more bones, and then more. The first dig alone uncovered the remains of at least 11 different people, just scattered in shallow graves all over the backyard. The scale of this is just staggering. This wasn't just a few skeletons. Investigators eventually recovered close to 10,000 individual bone fragments. Many of them were charred and crushed, which made trying to identify anyone a truly monumental task. These are just some of the names of the missing men police had been looking for. Young men like Johnny Bear, Stephen Hale, and Roger Goodlet, the man whose disappearance is what made Tony Harris go to the police in the first place. For years, their families had absolutely no answers, and now they were faced with this horrifying truth.
As the discoveries just kept piling up, an arrest warrant was finally issued. But by then, Herb Baumeister was long gone. He'd fled the country, driving north all the way into Canada. His 2 lives were finally and violently crashing into one another.
They tracked him to a provincial park, where Baumeister ended his own life with a gunshot to the head. And his final words? A 3-page letter filled with nothing but self-pity about his failing business and his crumbling marriage. He never confessed. He never said a word about the men he murdered or the bone-filled yard he left behind. He took all of his secrets with him to the grave.
But the story doesn't end with Baumeister's death. Not by a long shot. Because police started to suspect that the killings at Fox Hollow Farm weren't the beginning of his terror, they were actually the end of it.
This timeline is incredibly revealing. Look, between 1980 and 1991, a serial killer they called the I-70 Strangler murdered at least 11 young men. Then, in 1988, Herb Baumeister buys Fox Hollow Farm, and almost immediately after 1991, the I-70 Strangler murders just stop. And that's right around the time the victims at Fox Hollow Farm start disappearing. The timing was just too much of a coincidence for investigators to ignore.
And then you look at the profile. The victims were young men, often picked out from the exact same Indianapolis gay bars that Baumeister was known to frequent. They were all strangled, and their bodies were dumped in rural areas right along the I-70 corridor. The method, the victim type, it all fit perfectly.
So the police theory is this. Why would you risk dumping bodies along a public highway if you own an 18-acre property with dense woods where no one would ever find them? Investigators believe that as soon as Baumeister owned Fox Hollow Farm, he didn't need the I-70 anymore. He had his own private, secluded dumping ground.
Now, even decades after Baumeister's death, this case is far from closed. For dozens of families, the search for answers is very much still going on.
This really shows you the challenge that's left. Of all the victims they found at Fox Hollow Farm, 10 have now been identified. But there are still at least 3 sets of remains that are completely nameless and thousands upon thousands of fragments that haven't even been assigned to an individual person yet.
But there is some hope here. Thanks to modern DNA technology, the Hamilton County Coroner's Office is still working tirelessly to put names to these remains. And they're still getting hits. As recently as January 2024, they were able to identify another victim, Manuel Resendez, who went missing way back in 1993. It gave his family at least some closure after 30 long years.
And that brings us to the final, haunting question. Herb Baumeister might be gone, but the full scope of his crimes? That remains a mystery, buried deep in his backyard. For the families of the I-70 Strangler victims, and for those whose remains are still just bone fragments waiting for a name, the search for the full truth of Fox Hollow Farm is far from over.